If you have ever found sand in your shoes after a trip to the beach, you may think you understand inconvenience. Crossing the Sahara caravan routes in centuries past would quickly disabuse you of that notion. The desert had a particular talent for taking a simple journey and turning it into a masterclass in discomfort. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. It is always interesting to see who is joining us from around the world. Now then, let us ease into tonight's journey together. The trans-Saharan caravan routes formed a spider's web of trade running across North and West Africa, reaching their peak roughly between the 8th and 16th centuries. What passed for a highway in this era was an endless procession of camels, merchants, porters, and occasionally the bones of those who had discovered the limits of their own enthusiasm. The kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai all owed much of their wealth and their headaches to these routes, where gold, salt, slaves, and textiles changed hands with remarkable efficiency and even more remarkable bureaucracy. There are many ways to make a fortune, but willingly crossing an ocean of sand by camel remains a particularly enthusiastic one. Consider, for instance, that salt was so valuable on these routes. It was sometimes exchanged directly for gold by weight. Few today would regard a salt block as security for one's retirement. But in the Sahara, the logic seemed unassailable. And while camels are universally celebrated as the so-called ships of the desert, their willingness to wander off and disappear over the nearest dune was less well publicized in the travel brochures of the era. Picture a caravan preparing to depart from the trading city of Timbuktu. Porters wrap their heads in thick indigo cloth, hoping in vain to keep the sand from entering every available orifice. Merchants haggle over bundles of cowrie shells, gold dust, and bolts of cloth with the single-mindedness of people who know they will soon be counting every sip of water. Camels are loaded with awkward slabs of salt, each one lashed down with a confidence that experience suggests is deeply misplaced. Somewhere at the edge of the crowd, a local official reviews records with the weary satisfaction of a man who has invented 3 new taxes since breakfast. The air smells of livestock, dust, and ambition, not always in that order. For every grand tale of gold-laden kings returning from pilgrimage, there were countless smaller stories of traders who considered a journey successful simply if all their water skins were still accounted for at the end. Life on these routes required a certain patience, a flexible approach to hygiene, and more trust in one's camel than most people reserve for their close relatives. Nothing quite said civilization like a mud brick inn built to withstand everything except the midday sun and a meal of dried millet that tasted as if the recipe had survived unchanged since the Neolithic. So begins the slow march across the desert's endless sands, where survival depended as much on luck as on wisdom, and where history was written in footprints that the wind was only too eager to erase. The Sahara Desert of the medieval era was not merely a stretch of sand, but a vast and varied geography that divided North Africa from the lush savannas and forests farther south. By the middle of the 8th century through to the 16th century, the caravan routes that threaded their way across this expanse had become arteries for trade, religion, and no small measure of personal misery. These routes connected kingdoms such as Ghana, Mali, and later Songhai to North African ports and markets, binding together societies that otherwise had little in common, beyond a mutual understanding that sand was best left on the margins of everyday life. Life around the routes depended upon more than the whims of the desert. Towns such as Sijilmassa, Ol-Walata, and Timbuktu emerged at the desert's edge and at rare oases, serving as both gateways and barriers. Their mud brick houses, often single-story and flat-roofed, offered little in the way of comfort, but considerable relief from the sun. Every available wall surface was pressed into service, either for the storage of grain or as a canvas for chalked accounts, numbers tallying who owed what from a caravan last seen several months earlier. When a trade town boasted a mosque, its mud minaret would stand out as the one building with real ambition, though even that was less a display of grandeur than of the relentless urge to avoid the elements. The people of these towns, dressed in layered robes and headcloths, usually dyed with the famous indigo of West Africa or left the color of unadventurous dust. Traders arriving from the north looked much the same as those from the south after only a few days' travel, since both cultures eventually converged into a single shade of brown by the time they reached the next well. Cloaks and turbans served as both sunblock and, when necessary, as a way to avoid identifying which caravan one might have recently joined or left. The soundscape consisted of haggling over cloth, salt, and gold, punctuated by the braying of camels and the sharp, insistent cries of water sellers who understood that demand for their wares tended to peak. The smells of roasting millet, drying hides, and hopeful spices drifted through the air, though the latter were usually present in amounts more symbolic than practical. The region's economy depended on a remarkable system of mutual inconvenience. Salt quarried from the mines of Tagaza was piled onto camels and carried south, where it could be worth its weight in precious metals. Gold dust, gathered from the rivers of the southern forests, traveled north in leather pouches or sewn into clothing seams. Cowrie shells from the distant Indian Ocean sometimes appeared as a form of currency, passed along by traders who must have questioned the wisdom of their own profession every time they counted them. While fortunes might be made, most traders considered themselves lucky if neither their merchandise nor their sense of direction had disappeared by journey's end. Religion threaded quietly through every aspect of daily life along these routes. Islam spread steadily through conversion and commerce, leaving behind mosques, schools, and the distinctive call to prayer that echoed from the simplest of towers. At the same time, traditional beliefs persisted, blending Islamic practice with local ceremonies. Amulets filled with Quranic verses and bits of local charm hung around the necks of traders and porters. Insurance policies for a journey in which even the camels seemed to require divine intervention. It was not uncommon for a caravan to pause at a shrine, or well, offering a coin or a few words to whatever spirit or saint was believed to have jurisdiction over fresh water and safe passage. Agriculture in the desert borderlands was largely a study in restraint. Date palms grew where water allowed, offering both shade and something vaguely edible to chew. Millet and sorghum formed the backbone of the diet, supplemented by livestock tough enough to ignore both sun and sand. The fields clung to the edges of towns, irrigated by hand and animal-drawn shadows. Those who worked the fields managed to look simultaneously weary and unimpressed by the merchants' tales of distant cities and gold. Architecture reflected a stubborn practicality. Walls were built thick, using mud mixed with straw to keep out both heat and thieves. Roofs, when they existed, were often flat and supported by wooden crossbeams. Though timber was rare and jealously guarded, the interiors were dim and cool by comparison to the open air, though comfort was measured more in degrees of dust than in any softer standard. No one expected luxury, only a gradual reduction in hardship. Power and authority shifted with the centuries. Rulers such as Mansa Musa of Mali became famous for displays of wealth, most notably his pilgrimage to Mecca, which left Cairo's gold market reeling for a generation. Yet, for the majority, political power was a distant rumor, enforced only by a town official with a ledger and what passed for a sense of humor. Taxes were levied with a frequency that seemed designed to test the patience of the traveling public rather than to enrich any central treasury. So the scene was set, a landscape drawn in sand and survival, populated by those who made a living from the improbable notion that somewhere beyond the next dune lay both profit and, if one was especially lucky, something resembling relief. The world of the Sahara caravan routes was shaped less by daring adventure and more by the quiet persistence of ordinary people, determined to keep moving, however little the desert seemed to care. The movement of caravans across the Sahara was a spectacle of endurance, not least because it depended largely on the camel, a creature whose reputation for patience is exceeded only by its capacity for looking unimpressed. The dromedary camel, imported to North Africa by the early centuries of the first millennium, had become essential by the time trans-Saharan trade reached its apex. Its odd gait, ability to subsist for days on thorny brush, and a rather singular odor made it the favored companion of merchants and porters alike. The sight and sound of a caravan assembling for departure was impossible to ignore. Camels lay in great, grumpy clusters, groaning with theatrical despair as they were loaded with bales of cloth, slabs of salt, sacks of millet, and the occasional passenger who fancied personal transport at its most basic. Preparation for the desert crossing was an exercise in practicality shaped by long familiarity with hardship. Merchants and caravan leaders counted and recounted waterskins, each fashioned from the hide of a goat, with ambitions toward leaking. Dates and dried meats were packed for sustenance, and every bundle was lashed down with a confidence rarely justified by the shifting desert. The men and women who traveled in these caravans wore layers of loose cloth, often dyed deep blue, or left the pale tan of unbleached cotton, depending on what dye was affordable or available at the last stop. Their faces, when visible beneath turbans and veils, bore the resigned expressions of those who had learned that comfort was negotiable, but reaching the next well was not. A typical caravan might number anywhere from several dozen to several hundred camels, depending on the season, the political climate, and how many people judged the potential profit to be worth the inevitable discomfort. Routes were chosen less for scenic value and more for the probability of finding water at intervals short enough to prevent the need for melodramatic improvisation. Oases became the informal capitals of the desert, each one a patchwork of date palms, low mud brick houses, and shallow wells. The air at such hubs was filled with the chatter of multiple languages, the cries of animals, and the background hum of officials who had perfected the art of taxation without ever having crossed the desert themselves. Religious ritual accompanied the mundane preparations. Prayers for safe passage were offered at the outset, sometimes at a mosque, sometimes at a small shrine or the foot of a promising tree. Amulets combining Quranic verses and older local charms could be seen clutched in hands or tied to camel harnesses. One did not wish to offend any power that might have an opinion on the stretch of sand ahead. As the caravan moved out, the rhythm of travel took over, walking or riding from dawn until the heat became intolerable, then pausing in the shade, if any existed, for a midday rest that never seemed long enough. Evenings brought a brief respite. Meals were taken communally, with conversation tending towards the practical rather than the philosophical. The darkness was complete, except for the flicker of small fires and the distant glimmer of stars that seemed indifferent to the efforts below. Agriculture along the routes was mostly left behind. Once the caravan entered the heart of the desert, though memories of green fields and fresh water remained a popular theme of conversation. Occasionally, a caravan might pass a small settlement whose gardens were sustained by an ancient well or a seasonal stream. These brief encounters were an opportunity not just to restock supplies, but to be reminded that, in some places, life managed to assert itself in spite of the environment's clear disapproval. Here, the architecture remained devoted to survival. Dwellings were built low, shielding inhabitants from both wind and excessive curiosity. Storage rooms were stocked with as much food and water as the harvest would provide, guarded more securely than most valuables. Political shifts along the routes were felt in subtle ways. Increased security at a border post might signal a new ruler or dynasty eager to prove their authority by intercepting taxes, or, on rare occasions, encouraging trade rather than extorting it. During the reign of Mansa Musa in the 14th century, caravans moving south toward Mali encountered more organized patrols, at least in theory, while those heading north braced themselves for the possibility of additional fees at every stopping point. News of distant wars or treaties trickled back to the caravan in the form of gossip, often so heavily edited by rumor that few took it seriously until it affected the price of salt or gold. The daily routine was relentless, but had its own rhythm. Camels plodded forward, guided by drivers who steered more by memory than by any visible landmarks. The sun colored the sand a different shade each hour, though the effect was mostly academic to those concerned primarily with how much farther until the next well. In the evenings, as merchants tallied accounts and guards shared muted stories, the wind carried with it the reminders of sand, distance, and the fact that the desert's concept of hospitality rarely changed. For all the hardship and repetition, the crossing of the Sahara persisted, less a romantic journey than a practical necessity, governed by markets and memory, and held together by those who understood that survival was often its own reward. As the daily repetition of the caravan became routine, the reality of water scarcity came into sharper focus. Water was not merely a commodity, it was the chief architect of life and death along these ancient routes. Every stage of the journey revolved around it. Wells, whether natural or dug by hand, marked the rhythm of progress. Some were little more than shallow depressions, lined with smooth stones and producing a trickle after hours of strenuous effort. Others formed the heart of a village or oasis, where camels, porters, and merchants jostled for priority beside troughs that often seemed too small for the crowd. Reaching a full cistern after a stretch of dry sand could produce a level of communal relief that rivaled religious observance for intensity. The value of water was reflected in daily habits. It was rationed with a parsimony that would make later accountants proud. Drinking, washing, and even prayers that required ritual purification were all performed with the smallest possible quantity. In towns near oases, children were well practiced in running errands, with clay jars balanced on their heads, eyes alert for any opportunity to fill an extra vessel. Travelers had a practiced gait, slow, deliberate, and designed to conserve every drop of sweat. When water skins cracked or leaked, the situation took on the gravity of a minor diplomatic crisis. The air itself seemed to crackle with anticipation or anxiety, as each group waited its turn at the well, often under the watchful gaze of a local official who managed the resource with the subtlety of a medieval customs agent. Trade at these water stops was brisk. Salt, gold dust, dried fruit, and even the rare bolt of imported cloth might be exchanged for direct access to the well. Local strongmen, or community elders, were quick to enforce rules that, while flexible on nearly every other matter, treated water as a near-sacred trust. Those who tried to take more than their share often found themselves the subject of swift and unanimous correction. Stories circulated of travelers who underestimated both the scarcity of water and the determination of those who protected it. Such individuals quickly became footnotes, remembered mostly as warnings to others. Religion was never far from these proceedings. The wells themselves sometimes carried an aura of sanctity, marked by a scrap of cloth or a small stone cairn, left as an offering to whichever saint or ancestor was believed to hold influence over the waters. Islamic practice required ritual cleanliness, and so travelers devised creative compromises, abridged washings and substituting sand for water in the prescribed ablutions when necessity demanded. Prayers for rain were not reserved for times of drought, but accompanied virtually every departure from a reliable source. The division between daily necessity and spiritual hope collapsed neatly in the face of the desert's indifference. Architecture in these oasis settlements was shaped with water in mind. Buildings crowded close to the well, forming tight clusters that minimized the trek for each refill. Roofs were flat, and sometimes layered with palm fronds to provide a measure of shade. Courtyards, where present, were often little more than swept earth or packed sand, but even these small spaces reflected an intent to capture every stray breeze. Storage rooms for water jars were built thick and cool, their mud walls baked hard by the sun. In wealthier towns, the presence of a second well or cistern was a mark of distinction, spoken of with pride and guarded with the same seriousness usually reserved for gold reserves. Political power in the region could be measured by control over water. Local leaders, whether appointed by distant kings or simply self-declared, established their authority by managing access, collecting modest fees, and occasionally deciding disputes with a degree of finality that brooked no appeal. During the reign of the Mali Empire, officials stationed at key oases kept meticulous records, at least as meticulous as could be expected, when entries were made on rough scraps of bark or bone. A shrewd water manager could expect respect, a certain degree of fear, and more than a few offers of partnership from passing merchants. They understood, as did everyone dependent on the routes, that water was the one commodity whose value never fluctuated. For the ordinary traveller, life between wells was little more than a test of endurance. Conversation in the long hours between stops revolved around the next opportunity for water, or, failing that, complaints about previous shortages. Meals were taken in silence, mouths full of coarse bread and salty dried meat, eyes fixed on the horizon. The taste of dust was ever present. Even the camels seemed to adopt a stoic resignation, plodding forward with the air of creatures who knew that the world rarely offered more than necessity. At night, when the cool settled in and water skins were checked and rechecked, relief was measured in sips rather than gulps. In every detail, the desert made it clear that survival was an exercise in restraint, vigilance, and a certain grudging respect for the limits imposed by water. Beyond water, trade stood as the central justification for enduring the Sahara's relentless austerity. The pulse of the caravan routes was determined by the movement of goods, each item carrying with it a trail of labor, negotiation, and silent resignation. Salt, harvested in places such as Tagaza, was cut into rectangular slabs and stacked in dusty pyramids before being bound to humps of camels. It traveled south in convoys, its value increasing with every passing league until it rivaled gold in the savannah markets. Gold dust, meanwhile, moved north from the forested edges of West Africa, carried in pouches sewn discreetly into clothing or secreted within bundles of more mundane cargo. The exchange rate between gold and salt fluctuated according to season, risk, and the prevailing mood of local officials, who were not above inventing a scarcity when they felt their share did not reflect their effort. Other commodities were traded in lesser quantities, but with undiminished importance. Ivory tusks, often brought from kingdoms farther south, found their way north to the Mediterranean, where artisans prized them for their work. Slaves, captured in raids or purchased from distant markets, marched with the caravans, enduring the same deprivations, though with none of the anticipation of profit. Textiles dyed with indigo or embroidered with geometric patterns, cowrie shells transported from the Indian Ocean, and copper ingots, shaped like small axes, all made their appearance at the great markets. The air at these centers of exchange was thick with the aroma of animal sweat, rare spices, burning dung, and the unmistakable tang of ambition. The trade towns themselves displayed their purpose with little pretense. In Timbuktu, mud brick houses, with flat roofs, clustered along narrow lanes, each structure designed to conserve cool air and, by luck, a little privacy. The business of trade spilled into every available space. Courtyards filled with bundles of wares and shouting negotiators became sites for the exchange of news, gossip, and the kind of reckoning that occurred when a merchant discovered their salt block had lost weight during the journey. Markets operated under the watchful gaze of guild elders and city officials who oversaw scales, measured taxes, and intervened only when a dispute threatened to slow the flow of tariffs. Social distinctions played out in subtle forms. The most successful traders acquired grander homes, often surrounding a shaded courtyard and boasting painted wooden doors. Most, however, lived in rooms little larger than storage bins. Porters and camel drivers, who bore the physical burden of the trade, found lodging in communal quarters, their possessions limited to spare robes, a battered bowl, and if prosperous, a prayer mat. The call to prayer punctuated each day, echoing across rooftops and fading into the desert. In the evenings, the wealthier townsmen dined on spiced stews with millet or rice, while workers shared flatbread and beans, discussing the possibility of future profit, as if it might somehow make their meal taste better. Religion continued to shape life and business in equal measure. Islamic law governed contracts, inheritance, and the conduct of marketplaces. Scholars in Timbuktu and Gao made a reputation for themselves by interpreting commercial disputes with a zeal only matched by their commitment to lengthy written opinions. Mosques constructed of mud and timber became the intellectual and spiritual heart of these towns, their minarets rising above the surrounding roofs, with a confidence the locals rarely felt. Quranic schools attracted students from surrounding regions, lending a certain scholarly patience to the atmosphere, though the students themselves might have preferred less sand and more shade. The agricultural foundation of these markets was modest but essential. At the edges of towns, women harvested dates from palm groves and gathered vegetables from small irrigated plots. Livestock, usually goats or lean cattle, were herded to market at dawn, their hooves raising clouds of dust that drifted through the lanes and into open shops. Food supplies followed the same routes as every other good, with dried fish from the Niger River or smoked meats from the savannah appearing in the market stalls when the season permitted. Political power in these towns was reinforced by the orchestration of trade. Town chiefs and appointed officials, sometimes acting on behalf of distant kings, sometimes on their own initiative, levied taxes on goods entering and leaving the markets. Their authority rested on the ability to maintain order, settle disputes, and guarantee, with varying results, the safety of persons and property. This bureaucracy adopted a formality that rarely translated into efficiency. Documents were kept, when they were kept at all, on wooden tablets or sheets of parchment, and the arrival of a distant royal emissary was often regarded as a cause for both public ceremony and private dismay. Evenings settled over the desert towns with a slow inevitability. The energy of the day gave way to lamps, burning animal fat, quiet voices from mosque courtyards, and the subtle relief of cooler air. As the merchants tallied gains and losses beneath roofs that seemed determined to shed dust on every ledger, the reality persisted that trade, for all its promise, was a bargain struck daily against the demands of the Sahara. The experience of a caravan town was defined as much by its built environment as by the goods exchanged within its market. Architecture along the Sahara routes emerged from a blend of necessity and local tradition, shaped by the scarcity of wood, the abundance of sun, and the need to survive regular sandstorms. Buildings were constructed from sun-dried mud bricks, sometimes strengthened with stone where it could be obtained without unreasonable effort. Roofs, always flat, rested on palm trunks or acacia poles scavenged from the few trees that grew along the riverbanks or oasis fringes. In larger towns, defensive walls formed an outer ring, built thick enough to withstand the odd bandit raid and the more persistent challenge posed by the wind. The houses themselves stood close together, presenting narrow faces to the street and deep shadows that offered a grudging shade for those passing by. Inside, homes were furnished with a minimum of fuss. Mats woven from reeds or palm leaves covered the hard-packed earth floors. The wealthier families claimed wooden chests, painted with geometric patterns, while most contented themselves with baskets, clay jars, and the heavy, uncomfortable benches that seemed designed more to discourage idleness than to promote rest. Doorways were hung with cloth to keep the dust outside, a task in which enthusiasm tended to outrun success. The kitchen, if present, featured a simple hearth, a clay oven, and racks for drying millet or fish. Cooking smells drifted through the courtyards, mingling with the ever-present scent of smoke and the occasional hint of spices reserved for special occasions. Walls in public buildings, particularly mosques and the larger merchant houses, were sometimes plastered and painted in pale colors, though these hues seldom remained vibrant for long. The famous mosques of Timbuktu, such as the Jingreba Mosque, displayed an architectural ambition rare in the region. Their buttressed walls and conical towers, topped with wooden beams and spikes, stood as landmarks for both the devout and the merely lost. These structures were maintained through communal labor, with townsfolk gathering yearly to repair earthen facades with fresh layers of mud, muttering that the process had not become any less tedious after centuries of repetition. Street life in these towns was a blend of commerce, social encounter, and the careful management of dust. Markets filled open squares and spilled into side lanes, with stalls erected from woven mats or patchwork canvas, anchored with piles of stone. The calls of traders hawking salt, gold, millet bread, and dates competed with the bleating of goats and the occasional clatter of a wooden cart. Beggars and children wove between the crowds, sometimes pausing to watch visiting travelers who brought new languages and rumors of distant wars. News circulated with the same speed as gossip, and accuracy usually arrived a few days later, if at all. Agriculture, while never dominant, left its mark at the edges of town. Date palms formed groves wherever water could be coaxed from a well or shallow irrigation channel. Small gardens produced onions, beans, and modest quantities of greens, tended by women whose expertise in making something from nearly nothing warranted more admiration than they usually received. Livestock remained central to both diet and economy. Goats, sheep, and the occasional scrawny cow crowded into small enclosures at night, their contributions to household wealth dutifully measured each morning in milk, meat, and less pleasantly, their effect on local air quality. Religious life shaped the rhythm of the day. The call to prayer sounded at regular intervals, echoing from the minarets and mingling with the background noise of daily business. Fridays brought larger gatherings to the mosque, where sermons addressed everything from the responsibilities of rulers and merchants to the more immediate issue of rain, or lack thereof. Festivals marked the Islamic calendar with brief surges in activity around the market and communal meals that did little to disguise the general shortage of delicacies. The mingling of faith and practicality was evident everywhere, from amulets stitched into clothing to the invocation of saints or ancestors when a caravan returned with its cargo, intact or otherwise. Political realities wove through this fabric with a characteristic subtlety. Town leaders, sometimes the appointed representatives of the great kings of Mali or Songhai, sometimes local notables, presided over disputes in shaded courtyards. Their authority rested on a reputation for fairness, a working knowledge of commercial law, and when that failed, the ability to mobilize a sufficient number of relatives and allies. Taxes were extracted with a regularity that defied hope, their proceeds vanishing into the construction of new wells, or more often, the comfort of those collecting them. Despite these burdens, life in the caravan towns carried on with a steady purpose, shaped by a landscape that offered little and a society that had learned to make the most of it. While the built environment of the caravan towns provided structure, it was the constant undercurrent of risk that truly shaped the routines and anxieties of desert life. Banditry, taxation, and the unpredictable attitudes of local authorities were facts as immovable as the sun, forcing all who traveled or traded to weigh caution against opportunity. Caravans rarely departed without negotiating for protection, either from hired guards, alliances with local leaders, or, when optimism ran high, a trusted reputation that promised more trouble than gain for any would-be attacker. Still, the desert had a reputation for rewarding the most persistent opportunists. Bandit bands, drawn from nomadic clans or the dispossessed, watched the routes from hidden vantage points. Occasionally they struck, stripping a caravan of goods and leaving behind little but complaints and the need to invent new stories of heroic resistance. In response, taxation acquired a peculiar authority. Rulers and local officials framed their collections as necessary for the maintenance of order and the safe passage of trade. The town gates offered a daily performance in bureaucratic creativity, where officials counted and recounted goods, invented new categories for tariffs, and rarely hesitated to search for undeclared merchandise. Caravans learned to expect taxes on everything from salt to livestock, from the number of camels to the number of drivers. Even an unlucky porter might discover that his own feet had become taxable assets, if only for a day. Despite these impositions, merchants accepted the arrangement with the resigned air of people who understood that the alternative, open theft, was less predictable and far more disruptive to business. Within this system, power and influence often shifted subtly. A ruler's ability to command loyalty from local headmen and the various merchant guilds was tested each time a new tax was proposed or a caravan fell victim to theft. During the reign of Askia Muhammad in Songhai, attempts were made to standardize tolls and suppress bandit gangs. The result was an increase in paperwork and a modest improvement in safety. Though merchants continued to suspect that banditry and officialdom were not always as distinct as they appeared, ordinary citizens, for their part, learned the value of discretion. No one questioned where a new luxury rug or unusually fine robe had come from. News of failed caravans traveled quickly, though the facts tended to arrive after the more entertaining details had been embroidered beyond recognition. Religious authority sometimes offered an alternative system of justice. Imams and Islamic scholars, respected by Muslims and non-Muslims alike, arbitrated disputes and occasionally intervened to settle conflicts between traders and officials. Their courts were less concerned with fines than with restoring order, though this often meant a great deal of talking and a careful avoidance of difficult questions about missing property. Prayers for safe passage were offered with regularity, but it was understood that divine assistance, much like bureaucratic reform, was not guaranteed to arrive before the next caravan set out. Throughout these uncertainties, daily life persisted with a stubborn regularity. Shops opened at dawn, their owners sweeping dust from thresholds that defied every effort to remain clean. Scribes, well versed in the art of recording transactions and disputes, could be found beneath the arcades, their boards covered with figures written in charcoal or ink. Young boys carried messages through the narrow lanes. Women carried water from the wells and haggled in the markets for millet, dates or fish, always alert to the prospect of a better price. The town crier, whose news was as current as his memory and as accurate as his inclination, made his circuit before noon, announcing arrivals, departures, and the occasional change in leadership. Agriculture and food supply bent to meet the demands of security. Flocks were often moved at night or along lesser-known paths to avoid theft. Those who farmed near the OCs developed elaborate arrangements with the local guards, offering small payments in exchange for permission to harvest at less risky hours. The annual date harvest became a time of both cooperation and wariness. Surpluses were hoarded against the risk of banditry or bad seasons. Even the preparation of meals reflected this caution. Dried meat and grain could be hidden or quickly carried away, while more perishable produce was consumed without delay. The architecture of defense appeared everywhere. Gates closed at dusk, watched from above by guards who, if not always attentive, were at least visible. Walls were repaired after each rain, and on rare occasions, after the more destructive efforts of an ambitious raider. Homes featured narrow, barred windows and hideaway spaces where valuables, such as copper, gold dust, or legal documents, could be concealed from anyone with too much curiosity. In all this, the people of the Saharan towns displayed a patience that suggested endurance was its own form of resistance, proof that life would continue in spite of the desert's encouragement to do otherwise. The influence of religion in Saharan towns and along the caravan routes was not confined to ritual or faith. It permeated the habits, architecture, and even the unspoken agreements that allowed trade to function across so many boundaries. The predominant religion was Islam, spreading southward from North Africa by both the sword and the ledger, borne by scholars, merchants, and rulers who found that prosperity and piety made suitable traveling companions. Mosques formed the visual and social heart of most settlements, built of the same sun-dried mud as the houses, but set apart by their minarets and the regular rhythm of prayer that divided the day as reliably as any clock. In towns such as Timbuktu, Gao, and Wallata, the call to prayer drifted above the market noise at dawn, noon, afternoon, sunset, and night. Even those who had little interest in religious debate found themselves measuring the day by these sounds. The Friday prayer attracted the largest crowds, filling the courtyards and sometimes spilling into nearby streets, while the local imam offered sermons that ranged from practical advice: keep your contracts honest, avoid the temptation to water down the honey, to matters of doctrine and the hazards of excessive ambition. Education became closely linked with religion. Quranic schools operated in most large towns, where children memorized verses and learned the rudiments of law, arithmetic, and occasionally the secret of writing a contract that actually made sense to both parties. Islamic law shaped not only personal behavior, but also the conduct of trade. Contracts were witnessed, and when disputes broke out, brought before qadis, whose patience for half-truths was famously limited. The town records, kept on wooden boards or rare pieces of parchment, listed debts, repayments, and the inevitable fines for those who failed to keep their word. The institution of the Waqf, a charitable endowment, supported mosques, schools, and wells, and its administrators enjoyed the rare privilege of collecting donations without arousing universal suspicion. Religious festivals, such as Ramadan and the Eid celebrations, changed the daily pace. The fast was marked by daytime restraint and evening feasting, though the menu of dates, millet cakes, and the occasional roasted goat reminded everyone that culinary variety was not the desert's strongest suit. Despite the dominance of Islam, pre-Islamic beliefs and practices lingered at the edges of daily life. Amulets containing Quranic verses, Quranic tablets, and fragments of older charms were worn for protection, insurance against mishap in a landscape that inspired caution. Wells and prominent trees sometimes attracted offerings, coins, beads, or small bundles tied in cloth, left for spirits whose names were seldom spoken aloud, but were widely acknowledged as useful to keep in good humor. When a caravan prepared to depart or returned safely, sacrifices were sometimes made quietly, away from the mosque, in deference to local tradition and the lingering suspicion that extra precautions rarely went amiss. The architecture of religion was both practical and symbolic. Mosques were built with thick walls and few windows to keep the interior cool, their floors covered with mats, or, in wealthier towns, woven carpets, showing the geometric patterns of West African design. The minaret, sometimes little more than a square tower or a pyramidal mound, dominated the skyline. It served as both a lookout and a symbol, a visible statement of a town's claim to both faith and organization. In the larger mosques, libraries were established, holding collections of manuscripts in Arabic and local languages. These texts, written on parchment or imported paper, covered law, science, poetry, and the less discussed art of record-keeping. Their preservation depended on the diligence of scholars, whose commitment to copying and maintaining them was tested each rainy season, when leaks and insects made their annual appearance with what felt like religious regularity. Religion also shaped public charity and social hierarchy. Orphans, widows, and travelers could expect aid, at least in theory, from the mosque or the Waqf administrators. In reality, the distribution of charity tended to favor the well-connected, though a beggar with enough persistence could survive on the fringe of town life. The imam, the qadi, and the teachers formed a respected elite. Their pronouncements followed in matters ranging from property disputes to the appropriate length of fasting. Their homes, while not luxurious, were often better built than those of the average merchant, and their kitchens, if not richer in variety, seldom ran short of guests. Thus, in these towns drawn from the desert, the rituals and institutions of religion served as both a comfort and a discipline. They offered structure in a world where survival depended as much on mutual trust as on the promise of reward in the world to come. Here, faith and pragmatism met with little fuss, reinforcing patterns of life that could sometimes seem as ancient and unchanging as the sands themselves. The caravan towns of the Sahara were not solitary outposts, but part of a broader web of exchange that reached far beyond the desert. Each market day brought a convergence of languages, currencies, and customs that revealed just how connected these distant places had become. The traders from the north arrived with Arab silver, Berber wool, and finely worked copper, drawn from the cities stretching along the Mediterranean coast. From the south, merchants brought gold dust, cola nuts, and slaves, their goods shaped by the patterns of riverine agriculture and forest trade. The resulting transactions were rarely straightforward. Bargaining was expected to last much of the day, with every participant determined to prove that patience and suspicion were as important as skill with numbers. In the midst of this commercial bustle, the architecture of trade adapted to the demands of climate and commerce. Market squares consisted of hard-packed earth, shaded where possible by makeshift awnings of palm frond or patched linen. Stalls were constructed for easy dismantling at season's end, their owners well aware that a market's fortunes could rise or fall with the next shift in politics. The wealthier merchants owned stone warehouses, their thick walls defending against theft and the worst of the heat. Within these storage rooms, bolts of indigo-dyed cloth were stacked alongside cowrie shells and baskets. The air inside was thick, musty, and tinged with the faint sweetness of ripening fruit and the more persistent smell of camel hide. Daily life for the market's workers was governed by the rhythms of trade. Porters arrived before dawn to unload new arrivals, their backs bent under heavy bales and their voices raised in arguments over whose turn it was to claim the least offensive task. Water sellers threaded between crowds, their large goatskin bags slung over one shoulder, offering small cups for a handful of coins. Scribes set up in the shade of the mosque, their reed pens and wooden boards prepared for the inevitable rush of contracts, IOUs, and the official recording of grievances. The soundscape was a blend of haggling, animal noises, and the low drone of prayer from the nearby minaret. In the background, women sold street food, their stalls displaying flatbread, skewered meat, and bowls of beans, seasoned with whatever could be spared. The social fabric of these towns was as layered as the trade goods themselves. Lineage and reputation could open doors, while a history of failed ventures or unpaid debts might close them more firmly than any lock. Many families had profited for generations from the caravan trade, their daughters married into other merchant dynasties, their sons sent to study in Timbuktu or Marrakech. Outsiders could attain success, but it generally required the sponsorship of a respected local or the slow, careful accumulation of trust over many years. The presence of travelers from distant lands was noted and commented on. News passed quickly from merchant to merchant, often adjusted in the telling until only the names remained certain. Religion remained ever present within this commercial world. Pious merchants might pray for fair dealings before opening negotiations and end the day with alms to the poor, hoping that honesty might improve their fortunes in both markets and the next world. Disputes over weights, measures, or the quality of goods were referred to the local Qadi, whose rulings were accepted with a mixture of resignation and relief. On Fridays, the market paused for the congregational prayer, and for a brief hour, the noise and negotiation gave way to silence and the measured voice of the imam. The return to business was brisk. Commerce, it seemed, waited for neither sermon nor blessing. Agriculture continued to provide the foundation for these markets, though the products on offer changed with the seasons. Date harvests in the autumn brought a glut of sweet fruit, preserved for use in the lean months. Fresh vegetables from irrigated plots were sold at a premium, their scarcity reflecting the difficulty of carving sustenance from the edge of the desert. Livestock, goats, sheep, and the rare fattened cow were tethered at the market edge, watched over by children with sticks and the resigned expressions of those only marginally more interested in the animals than the buyers. Political developments left their imprint on the character of trade. A new ruler might decree a change in tariffs or introduce a new coinage, Each reform met with the same mixture of suspicion and compliance that defined the merchant class. Occasional reports of unrest farther along the route, flooded roads, closed borders, or an outbreak of violence, were met with adjustments to prices, a flurry of messages, and elaborate precautions that only sometimes proved effective. Through all these uncertainties, the market endured. It was a place of anticipation and memory, where each transaction carried with it both the weight of tradition and the hope, however modest, of future gain. Communication across the vast distances between Saharan towns was an exercise in both determination and patience. News rarely traveled as quickly as the people who might benefit from hearing it. Instead, information moved with the caravans themselves, packed into the minds of merchants, scribes, and camel drivers who spent days or weeks retracing familiar routes. The spoken word remained the chief vehicle for both fact and rumor. Every arrival in town brought a fresh round of speculation as to whether this caravan had survived banditry, drought, or the mysterious incompetence of its rivals. Written messages did exist, but literacy was largely confined to merchants, religious officials, and scribes. Letters were wrapped in layers of cloth and wax, entrusted to men whose reliability was measured in generations. Marketplace notice boards sometimes displayed announcements in Arabic script, ranging from proclamations of new tariffs to the more heartfelt appeals for lost animals or relatives. When disputes arose over the truth of some report, the town's elders would gather in shaded courtyards, each reciting what they had heard and, when possible, referencing the rare letter or tablet that claimed official status. In most cases, memory served as both archive and editorial board, which occasionally led to creative approaches to inconvenient facts. In this culture of slow-moving information, oral storytelling became a central institution. Professional bards, known in some regions as griots, were highly regarded for their ability to recall not only genealogy, but also the fluid fortunes of trade, alliances, and famous disputes. Gatherings at dusk would feature performances in which history was recited with a confidence that owed as much to performance as to fidelity. Families measured their place in society by the stories told about their ancestors, while caravans sometimes hired storytellers for the journey, ostensibly to ward off boredom, but perhaps also as a form of insurance against vanishing into obscurity. Religion provided another channel for the spread of news. Imams and scholars, accustomed to writing and receiving letters from distant towns, served as informal correspondents. Their messages ranged from legal queries to theological debates, often accompanied by updates on local harvests, security, or the occasional memorable scandal. Fridays were a particular occasion for the sharing of fresh information, as the larger communal prayer drew visitors and traders who used the gathering to exchange both goods and the latest word from the wider world. Political decisions and edicts, when they arrived, carried with them the signs of long travel and frequent retelling. Royal messengers from the Mali or Songhai empires might present themselves at the town's gate, dusty and unimpressed, bearing documents sealed with clay and inscribed with elaborate calligraphy. Their arrival was treated as both a ceremony and a disruption. Town leaders would assemble to hear the text read aloud, with the result interpreted and, when necessary, cautiously rephrased for local consumption. In practice, the implementation of central policy varied as widely as the attentiveness of those meant to enforce it. Some decrees were enacted with considerable ceremony. Others faded into irrelevance before the next caravan arrived. The architecture of information mirrored the broader world of Saharan towns. Mosques provided space for both worship and study, with libraries of handwritten texts copied over generations. In wealthier settlements, scholars taught small classes in shaded rooms, their voices steady above the rattling of market carts and the braying of donkeys. The tools of communication were simple: reed pens, ink made from soot and gum, rough paper, or smoothed wooden tablets. Ink-stained fingers marked out those who worked with words, rather than with goods or animals. Still, the daily business of news remained tied to informal gatherings. Traders in shadowed arcades, women drawing water at the well, and elders leaning against the sun-baked walls to discuss which events deserved to be believed. For the average resident, the experience of waiting for news was a condition to be endured rather than overcome. Rumor filled the void of certainty. A story about an outbreak of violence 3 towns away could inflate the price of salt or gold overnight, only to be replaced by a report of sudden peace or a change in weather. By the time the next caravan arrived, the ambiguity of information meant every decision, from the route chosen by a trader to the planting of millet near an oasis, was accompanied by a silent calculation regarding what might actually be true. Thus, life along the caravan routes moved to the rhythm not only of trade and prayer, but also of news that wandered as slowly and uncertainly as the caravans themselves. Trust was built on repetition rather than evidence, and the memory of past events often proved more durable than any written record. This was a world in which information traveled with the sand, reluctantly, unpredictably, and in its own time. The act of travel itself, so fundamental to life along the Sahara caravan routes, was a steady negotiation with discomfort and unpredictability. Journeying from one settlement to the next required an acceptance of delay and inconvenience that would test even the most seasoned merchant or pilgrim. The preparation for departure began days in advance, with deliberate lists drawn up to account for every item of cargo, every skin of water, and every person joining the group. The caravan leaders, often chosen for their memory and their ability to maintain both discipline and increasingly complicated relationships, reviewed the state of the camels and drew up plans that relied as much on a sense of resignation as on optimism. The first hours, after leaving the safety of the town's walls, were marked by a silence broken only by the shuffling of animals, the occasional barked instruction, and the persistent sound of hooves against packed sand. Caravans moved slowly, at the pace of the youngest camel, which, like most youth, showed little interest in hurrying for anyone's benefit. Every member of the company walked or rode in clothing that offered little variety but maximum utility: long robes, loose trousers, and head coverings that shaded the eyes and could be pulled across the mouth to keep out blowing dust. By the end of a day's journey, most garments bore the same dull, stubborn shade, untroubled by the original intentions of their makers. The rhythm of the road was defined by routine stops. At dawn, the air was chilly and carried a clarity that lasted perhaps an hour before the sun began to press down with a force that left little room for ambition or optimism. Midday was reserved for rest, when the caravan halted in the shallowest shadow available, its members sharing what little water and food they had apportioned for the interval. Meals were simple: a handful of dates, a strip of dried meat, coarse bread, which, like much on the journey, owed more to necessity than to pleasure. Conversation during these breaks was brief. The topics tended toward the practical distance to the next well, the health of the animals, and the likelihood that the route ahead would be less disappointing than previous experience suggested. The landscape offered few diversions. Sand stretched in every direction, broken only by the occasional patch of stubborn grass or a line of worn stones marking a path that countless feet had followed. At intervals, a solitary acacia tree or the remains of an abandoned well offered the illusion of variety. The heat brought with it a distortion of sound and vision, so that the horizon shimmered and distant objects appeared to float above the ground. For the traveler, the sensory experience was one of repetition, each day blending into the next, the sun creeping steadily across the sky and the wind carrying equal parts dust and indifference. The dangers of the road were constant companions. Bandits, as ever, adapted to the habits of the trade. The most successful avoided violence, preferring to appear with polite demands for tribute, calculated to be just slightly less than what it would cost to lose a camel or a cargo of salt. Caravans that failed to pay their way might find an overnight camp visited by thieves whose discretion in removing valuables was matched only by their ability to vanish before dawn. As always, the line between taxation and extortion was blurred, with some local protectors charging for safety and others simply suggesting that safety might be withdrawn. Religion and superstition travelled with the caravans. Prayers for safe passage were offered before leaving town, and amulets were checked and adjusted whenever the situation warranted, meaning, in practice, whenever the imagination supplied a new reason for unease. At the rare shrines built along the route, travellers would leave small offerings, coins, handfuls of grain, or even bits of clothing in the hope of securing favour. The recitation of verses or ancestral tales at night served as both entertainment and a hedge against anxiety. The architecture of the journey was temporary and unadorned. Camps consisted of makeshift windbreaks built from blankets, bundles of firewood, and the positioning of camels themselves to block the worst of the gusts. Fires were lit with dried dung, producing an aroma that over time became almost reassuring. Sleep was restless and shallow. Every member of the caravan rose before dawn, the repetition of routine offering the only real comfort in a landscape where novelty was rarely welcome. In this world, the journey was not simply a means of moving from one place to another, but a daily assertion that survival was best achieved by those with low expectations and a talent for enduring whatever the desert had decided to offer.